Welcome to the fifth episode of Regulate Tech with me, Nicklas, Berild, Lundblad, and
me, Richard Allan.
Today's subject is the truth. We thought we would take something small and easy to discuss in this week's episode. So the news this week contained, among other things, an item that said that Facebook has decided to take action against vaccine misinformation. How important do you think it is that platforms more and more take action on what is perceived to be misinformation?
So I think it's really important to separate out the different kinds of misinformation. And this is why I think truth is a great title for this episode, because I think it's not about, taking a particular position on lying, on whether everything that everybody says is accurate and correct all the time. Because I just don't think, we often talk about sort of things that are illegal offline should be illegal online. That's a very sort of common thing that people talk about. And frankly, except for very exceptional cases, for example, around monetary fraud or defamation, it's generally not illegal in most societies to lie. You can say what you think, and that's not typically breaking the law. So people can say what they think online just as they can say what they think offline. But there are these very specific areas in which speech can be harmful. And actually, it's not always false speech. It's not necessary that it's false, but there are particular kinds of false speech that are harmful. Defamation is a classic one. In most countries, that's made illegal. Fraud. I promised to sell you something and it's not as described. You told a lie about the product. That's illegal. And then in this case, the platforms are effectively rendering illegal another kind of false speech, which is false speech about vaccines. Because in the particular context right now, arguably, that's in a sense a sort of kind of fraud that you're committing on the public at large. So I think if we think of it in those terms, it's not an absolute, you must always tell the truth. You must never lie. It's not a position that says, all misinformation is necessarily actionable. But it is saying within the scope of things that people say, there are some things which are both untrue and harmful, and we may want to take specific actions against specific kinds of speech.
But let's look at the trend line, because both you and I have been around for long enough to know that the way that this has developed over the last decade or so is really interesting to track. Because in the beginning of the decade, for example, no major platform would take action against Holocaust denial, which is an obvious lie and a slight, anyway, it's a destructive lie at that. But that has changed. Most platforms now consider Holocaust denial something that they will remove. And vaccine misinformation is being added to things that are now being removed. And you have several other categories as well. What do you think about the long arc of the platform moderation? Does it bend towards the truth? Or is it still just going to be a set of categories, to your point, very specific categories that are carved out and moderated against?
I think it's a really interesting question because there is... I think as platforms have grown, there's been an expectation that they will take more responsibility for the things that happen over the platform. And again, the sort of archetypal internet model was we are the mere carrier, the mere conduit, and we're not responsible for anything that happens as a result of the stuff that's carried over our service. And I think that's not proved to be sustainable as an argument, at least for large, reputable internet platforms that have a significant place in our society and commerce. There is an expectation that they do care whether or not the content that they're carrying, which they didn't produce. I mean, they didn't write the stuff, they didn't film the videos, they didn't make the speech, but they are distributing it to other people. And so there is this expectation that they have a responsibility. So I think we're at a phase from, yes, version one, if you like, of the internet speech model was, go to the speaker. We are the mere conduit. If you've got a problem and somebody said something horrible, somebody said, something like Holocaust denial, go to the Holocaust denier and don't come to us. We're the mere conduit. And to a certain extent, the law provides some protections that kind of reflect that model still. But even if you are not strictly liable under the law, I think things moved on to people saying, well, you're distributing that Holocaust denial content. You can't just put it all on the speaker. you as the platform also need to do something. And you're right, platforms have moved on and said, well, we can't sustain a position where we know about the Holocaust denial and yet refuse to do anything about it. So we are going to intervene. And you're right, you talked about it as specific areas where they're now taking action. I think cumulatively, those specific actions do take us towards something which, I mean, arguably is about the truth, but perhaps a different framing would be that it's more mainstream or more media-like in terms of the environment we'll end up with. So whereas in that first free-for-all environment, you could say the craziest stuff. You could wave your Nazi flags, you could do your Holocaust denial, you could do all of this kind of crazy stuff. In the environment today, you can still do some pretty crazy stuff, but the worst of the worst is being taken out. In the future, I think the mainstream platforms are going to have a narrow definition of what's permissible, and a lot of the crazy stuff is going to go. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We've talked about this before. It can still exist on the internet, but I don't think mainstream platforms are going to be able to support the crazy stuff. It is death by 1,000 cuts because it's going to happen slice by slice. But the trend does seem absolutely clear that the crazier stuff is not going to be welcome on mainstream platforms.
One of the things that you've reminded us of often when we've discussed these different issues is that it's important to have a theory of the harm, right? To think about what the harm is. And I think it's interesting because in this case, there is a theory of the harm that is not fully articulated. It's sometimes phrased in terms of, you have a right to speech, but not a right to reach. And you've heard a lot of different commentators like Barack Obama say, we have lost our common baseline of facts. So the theory of harm here seems to be that if you allow for lies or misinformation, the individual case is not what gets you. It's the amount of lies over time, the compound effect of misinformation that erodes the public sphere. So that the theory of harm here is really a theory of harm to the public sphere and to our ability to deliberate as a society. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think there are two different things going on, actually, because there's one which is back to the specifics I keep talking about. So you can construct a very sort of precise theory of harm around something like anti-vaccination content. So you could say, the default in a sort of reasonably sort of progressive and well-educated society would be that 85% of people will take up the COVID vaccine, for example. That might be your default position. 15% will never do it. 85% would do it. And then you can look at that and say, but the COVID misinformation, if it's repeated, or the COVID vaccination misinformation, might take that down to 75%. And we've lost 10% of vaccinated people, and then you can calculate how many more people will get serious illness and die because of that 10% gap. So you can kind of construct a model that takes you from the misinformation to a very specific and calculated harm in society. And that can happen in a number of different areas. I actually think around Holocaust denial, again, if remember, Facebook was very resistant to that for a long period of time and recently changed its policies. And I think it changed its policy because people were associating increases of attacks on Jewish people with that form of speech. And there is evidence that shows that I think there's been increasing anti-Semitism expressed in a number of different countries. And you can make that association. And so you create a sort of very specific rational case for acting because there is a real world harm and the speech seems to be closely associated with that real world harm. So that's one one kind of approach. The other approach just says, lies are in some way sort of fundamentally undermining for society. And so you just, things must be truthful, not lies, almost as a moral case. And that I think is really interesting because I think that's where a lot of people want platforms to go, and really just to stand up for the truth as a moral imperative, as a preferred moral stance over lies which are seen as immoral. And that takes you much, much more broadly, actually, and I think is a much more contestable proposition. I think the first one, which says a specific form of misinformation, and actually, again, I don't think it even needs necessarily to be false. It is just, there is an association with a particular kind of speech and a real world harm. And we can make that association. We can argue about how close it's associated, but it's there. And again, on the truthful side of things, you might have, people pushing out information about one ethnic group having attacked another ethnic group in a situation where there is, real conflict in that society. And there actually may be some truth that an attack did occur, but the promotion of that information, you can say, or you can demonstrate that the more that information gets promoted, the more it winds up the other side and the more likely it is that people will die. So they say there were scenarios where you connect the speech to a harm. That I think we can deal with. The one that is really interesting for the public sphere is just, this notion that repeated telling of lies degrades the public sphere and is a harm in and of itself, but a much more incoherent harm than the kind of specific harms we've been talking about.
Yeah, no, and that theory sort of is not that hard to explicate, because you can say that unless we have a common frame of reference, if we do not agree on a basic set of facts, we are not going to be able to deliberate. And you could argue that when anything goes, the result is that your common framework breaks. And I think it's interesting because the way that this is often framed in platform discussions is that platforms should not become the arbiters of truth. Right, that's a key phrase that I've heard several times and probably also spoken several times. And this idea is clean and easy to understand. You shouldn't ask a private company to determine what's true and not true in a democracy. But it begs the question of what platforms should be. Because if you're not the arbiters of truth, that's a negative definition. How do you avoid becoming purveyors of lies if that's the alternative to being the arbiters of truth? Is there really a moral middle ground when it comes to these things? Or do you think increasingly that you have to, as a platform, accept that you're going to have a normative role on the public debate?
I mean, I think the challenge is that for many of the things that we care most about, there isn't a single truth. And so that's the real challenge. I mean, if we look, and I've been very involved in politics, we look at the debate around Britain leaving the European Union. And there was a famous number that was thrown around, and it was if Britain left the European Union, it would save £350 million a week from not having to pay money into the EU. And people looked at that, and the statisticians, and they said, well, actually, the figure is more like 250 million because there are various discounts and rebates and things. At the same time, the Remain side, and to be candid, that the side I was on, would sort of be arguing that leaving the EU will cost X amount of money. Because we're going to have reduced trade, and that's going to cost. So everyone is throwing these numbers around, and that's a really concrete scenario. Like, does the platform intervene and say, well, you're allowed to say it's £100 million a week or £200 million a week, but not £350 million a week because these statisticians have said this? Actually, those numbers in a sense represented people's view. If you were on the Leave side, you would make up the biggest number you possibly could. And if you're on the Remain, for the savings you get by leaving, if you're on the Remain side, you make up the biggest number you possibly can for what it's going to cost you to leave. And again, I don't feel a platform should be in the business of trying to decide between those different numbers. They get argued out in the public domain. And there's so many areas like that where the stuff that we really care about, there are many truths. Put it that way, as in there's a sort of a set of sort of underlying facts, and then a whole lot of spin that gets put on top of those underlying facts that then becomes the political argument that's being advanced. And yes, I can, as a citizen, I can go, I wish these guys wouldn't exaggerate. They shouldn't have used the 350 million figure. But again, I'm not sure platforms should be in the business of deciding what kind of numbers and arguments and things can be put forward in a political context. And that's the area which I think is very high risk. And when they say we don't want to be arbiters of truth, I think that's what they really mean. They really mean when something is contested, which actually is when people are most excited about it, the contest is between the different parties. In that case, the contest is between the Leave campaign and the Remain campaign in the UK referendum. It's not between the Leave campaign and Facebook or the Remain campaign and Facebook as an actor in that debate. So that's, I think, very specifically where we're saying don't be the arbiters of truth. And I support that. I don't think platforms should be actors with their own viewpoint in political debates that are perfectly capable of playing out on their own across all of the media as well as on social media.
So you mean, I agree with that. I think that's the right way to frame it, to say that there are areas like that where it would be directly harmful, and I think lots of people will find it offensive if platforms stepped in. But let me sort of suggest another way of framing this. These are areas where where people can reasonably disagree. Holocaust denial, there's no reasonable disagreement. There's no reasonable disagreement on QAnon conspiracy theory. Shouldn't you just be able to have a very simple test that says, is there reasonable disagreement on this issue? And then sort of use that as a watershed criterion to say, there's no reasonable disagreement on whether or not the QAnon conspiracy is true, Holocaust denial is true, etc. Is the platform discussion sort of overcomplicating this by pointing to a set of reasonable disagreements and taking those reasonable disagreements as grounds for excluding statements that very clearly seem to be false?
I think, and this is again, exactly why I get so passionate about being really precise and specific, because there are all these. I mean, one of the worst arguments ever in politics is often the slippery slope argument. If we ban Holocaust denial, then we're going to end up having to, ban discussion of other historical events where there is a genuine dispute and debate. No, you can set a limit and a threshold, exactly as you say, and you can say these things are outside the limit and the threshold. And a little bit of it is, in criminal justice, you kind of have these ideas of guilty beyond reasonable doubt or guilty on the balance of probabilities. You set different thresholds for when you're going to say that somebody is guilty. Guilty beyond reasonable doubt means you have no serious question that individual is guilty of a particular offense. And I think with some mistruths, you can apply that standard. So you can say, Holocaust denial, there is no reasonable doubt that one side of the argument, if you can put it that way, is correct. This thing happened and the people on the other side of it are wrong. Beyond reasonable doubt, they are wrong, and therefore we have a substantive case for removing it. QAnon might be the same. And I think in practice, that's where the platforms have gone. I mean, the stuff that they are now removing is the beyond reasonable doubt stuff where there is very clearly one side that is right and one side that is wrong, to that sort of standard. I think where it gets more iffy in the scenario I described previously around the cost savings from the EU, that was much more sort of balance of probabilities argument, where it's like 50-50, who's right, who's wrong, or much closer. And even if it's like 60 or 70, 60-40, 70-30, a platform may say, well, even if, these guys have exaggerated and it looks pretty wrong, it's kind of not beyond reasonable doubt that the other side have got an arguable case. And I think one of the things we might helpfully do is get this much more out into the public domain, this sort of form of rationalization for your decision making. So we don't end up with a slippery slope argument. Well, you banned Holocaust denial, therefore you must ban the 350 million claim in the EU referendum debate because you're against untruths. Well, no, one is an untruth that is absolutely clear. The other is an untruth which is debatable. And so it doesn't follow that because you ban one, you ban the other. So I think, again, being very explicit about the kind of thresholds that are being applied would be helpful. Interesting, this is what newspapers do. I mean, they do this all the time. So when newspapers say they publish, true content, and I think we can take them at face value, other people will contest that and say, this newspaper's terribly biased, particularly the more tabloidy ones. But they have a legal department and they have people who check stuff, and they will publish it when they believe it meets a sufficient threshold of truthfulness. I mean, newspaper can't rely on 100% truthfulness, but they have a sufficient threshold, which is, for example, that they have two separate sources corroborating the story. Two separate sources corroborating a story is not guaranteed to be true, but they've decided that's sufficient. So again, talking about and this is, some people will contest this, but not talking about truth in terms of absolutes. It's not 100% true or 100% false, but talking about the point at which you think something is sufficiently true for you to act on it, I think is helpful. And then being very open and explicit about how you're making those decisions.
One way of doing this, of course, is to instead talking about truth, talking about information quality, saying that this information is corroborated, it's been backed up by research, there is an historical record, etc. Do you think we'll get to a point where we can meaningfully index information quality and have that be a criterion that just below a certain threshold, we're not going to disseminate that content, or we're simply just going to mark it as hearsay or speculation or something like that?
I mean, I find that attractive, and I suspect we both do, because we're on the sort of nerdy end of things. But yeah, to talk about information quality feels more technical than truth and falsehood, which sort of carries this moral sense with it. And I don't think they're not moral decisions in that sense. They're not, or we shouldn't be thinking of them primarily as moral decisions, that the liar is immoral, the truth teller is a saint. We should be much more candid that it's about, I mean, good people can get things wrong and bad people can get things right. So it is about understanding how right or wrong, or how likely something is to be right or wrong, that I think is most useful, rather than necessarily, associating a particular set of moral values with that rightness or wrongness. And so to give you, another example, I got very involved in actually as a elected representative, mobile phone cell towers. People get very exercised and say mobile phone cell towers are causing cancer and all sorts of things. And when you dig into it, you can see that way beyond, reasonable doubt, mobile cell towers do not cause cancer. They are as safe as anything can be. But you can't say, it's 100% not. You can never say 100%. You can say 99.9999 recurring. But the critical thing for someone who comes across that debate, if that debate is playing out online, is to understand the information quality of each side of the argument. So if on the one side you have, experts in non-ionizing radiation who have carried out peer-reviewed studies into the effect of mobile phone signal on the brain, that carries a particular sort of quality label, which I think is at the very top end of the scale. If on the other side you have somebody who said, in my village, somebody got cancer and we have a mobile phone mast, I mean, it's interesting, but the level of quality in terms of the contribution to the debate is just not at the same level. And so all of those pieces of information should be in the debate. You don't necessarily want to shut them out. But for the person who's involved, understanding where they come from, what kind of weight to place on them, I think is the most important thing. And we can, again, read that across to lots of other debates. Understanding quality is critical, and maybe more helpful than saying, 100% right, 100% wrong. It's saying, well, you can feel, 99.9 recurring percent satisfied that the mobile phone masts are okay because of the weight of the quality of the information on that side of the argument versus the weight of the quality of the information on the other side of the argument. And that lets you form an informed view.
And it essentially is applying the scientific method, not saying that anything is 100% right or wrong, but saying the overwhelming evidence suggests that there is no cancer to be had from mobile cell towers. Another issue where this is going to become more and more interesting, I think, is the issue of climate change, where there is the debate, an open debate between climate change deniers and people who are very clear about the fact that we have anthropogenic climate change. It's sort of a hot button issue. There's a lot of debate. Science is solidly on the side of anthropogenic climate change. But at some point, it also becomes really interesting to ask not about truth or lies, but to ask about doubt. So are you allowed to doubt things? Because that's the pernicious sort of little crack that you open up in this notion of a common frame of reference, where you say, well, for climate change, for example, you could say, well, look, these are really complex models. I'm not sure that we're able to accurately model the climate in a way that is meaningful. This is what Freeman Dyson said, and it immediately got him branded as a climate denier. And that doubt seemed to me to be an interesting intersection between truth and falsity. Are you allowed to doubt anything? Should doubt be that cheap? How do we think about that? Because that's another part of the scientific method, right? So how do we?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. And again, let's look at the vaccination situation. It is possible that some of the vaccines that are being produced will later turn out to have serious negative side effects. And the way that we discover that is people do doubt their safety. and ask questions, and they test those questions. And if there is a problem, we want them to find that early. We want them to doubt. And so it is, like, as you say, part of the scientific method. It's essential that people are able to doubt things. But are we able to sort of hold both things in our minds at the same time? One, a commitment to getting on and getting vaccinated because the current evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of it being a good thing, at the same time as entertaining reasonable doubts and the possibility that someone may, later find out to be a problem. I've always had an issue around this notion of the precautionary principle, which, again, it means lots of things, different things to different people, but people will justify it not to do anything at all. The precautionary principle is, until you can prove the vaccine is 100% safe, we shouldn't take it. Well, no, I'm not.
It's logically impossible to do that. You can't prove that something is 100%. That's sort of anyone who sort of happened to accidentally have scientific theory inflicted on them.
Exactly. So I think the answer is, and again, you've heard this in the argument, it sort of gets cited. I had it with the cell towers. Don't put a cell tower. Precautionary principle says no cell towers in my neighborhood until you've proved they're safe. Well, no. It does say, do all the sensible things, get your non-ionizing radiation experts to look at it, and get your vaccination and your epidemiological experts to look at a vaccine, and then if it's safe enough, go ahead. And at the same time, entertain the doubts, but don't let the doubts undermine the action that you're taking today. And that is hard. I mean, we should be honest, that is hard for people to do. It's a stretch, but there is no alternative. Like, that is the way these things have to work, that we have to both proceed on the best information we have and doubt enough to keep testing that the information we have is the right information, and make sure that we spot any unanticipated consequences of the course of action we've taken.
And again, I mean, there's no technical fix here. The fix is an educated citizenry, the people who are educated in thinking about these things in a way that allows them to see that doubt is reasonable, but not something that should adversely affect their willingness to get vaccinated, for example. But you could imagine, I mean, if we sort of extrapolate from the situation we are today, you could imagine that there are fields where there will be people who essentially say, well, doubt in this particular case is going to be so corrosive to what we're trying to accomplish, and we cannot control the level of doubt or the effects of doubt. So actually, doubt is harmful. There's a theory of harm around doubt. At that point, we enter interesting territory, because then we come back to the notion that platforms should be engaged in social engineering. And in this case, we've seen this social engineering before. It can be traced back to Greek philosophy, where Plato speaks of the noble lie, the noble lie that underlies the republic, so that everyone complies with, in this case, a very unfair and unequal hierarchy that he put in place in the republic. So how do platforms get away from that? Because that seems to be a natural next step if you feel that the common frame of reference is being eroded by the mere existence of doubt.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be one of the hardest questions. I mean, when I think about a lot of doubt, I think it's often an expression of something else. So again, going back to my mobile phone mast example, a lot of the people who were expressing doubt around those masts, I felt, were primarily concerned with the fact that someone was going to build a great big bit of infrastructure next to their house. So in a sense, it wasn't about the radiation at all. It was about, the classic thing that nobody wants, a great big sort of metal tower built in their back garden. And again, I think similarly, in a lot of these other debates, when we talk about climate change, there's quite a lot of I don't want to change my lifestyle. I want to go on holiday without feeling guilty. And so I'm going to question the foundation of climate change, not necessarily as a sort of purely intellectual exercise, but as a way of making me feel better about what I want to do. And again, there's lots of emotion and lots of personal issues that we bring to these questions that often express themselves through a form of doubt. In the US election, and commentators have talked about this, but people casting doubt on the election, not because they've necessarily done the analysis of how voting machines were used in Georgia, but what they're really saying is, I feel threatened for whatever reason, by the fact that my guy has lost. And because I feel threatened by the fact that my guy has lost, the way I'm going to express that is to sign up to all these doubts about the voting process. Having never, ever been interested in the voting process ever before, having no knowledge of it, but you offer me that, and I'm going to become the biggest advocate for the fact that X voting system manufacturer was owned by the Cubans or whatever. And then if you talk to that person, you talk to them about trying to prove that the voting system was not owned by the Cubans. I'm deliberately using a different country so I don't get into the awful kind of defamation territory here, because there are ongoing cases. But if you debate on the substance of it, you're not really debating the issue that's the issue for them. And similarly, for the person who wants to go on their foreign holidays, to go and talk to them about CO2 levels in the atmosphere is kind of not the point. You're never going to get through. You need to have a debate about how they feel about going on foreign holidays, or in the case of the US elections, you'd have a debate about how that person feels about the outcome of the election. You're never going to answer their concerns by talking about the mechanics of voting and trying to prove it was all correct. So this I think is like the real challenge out there, which is, can platforms, if you wanted them to fix this thing, I don't think they fix it by either throwing the facts at the doubter, because the doubter's expressing a view which reflects a whole bunch of other things in their lives, which perhaps only tangentially related to the substance of the issue we're talking about. So they're not necessarily going to get there by throwing the facts at the person. They're not necessarily going to change minds by just deleting the stuff. Deleting the stuff, the climate change denier, who's really motivated by foreign holidays, whose stuff gets deleted, is not going to feel that anything's changed. They're just kind of going to feel, you see, it's even more of a conspiracy and a cover-up. You do get there by getting them into some deliberative space where they're able to discuss the issue. And I'm not sure, we've talked about this again before, how much we can expect a platform to steer that person into deliberative space where they talk about the issue as a whole, where you have a conversation about travel, the future of travel, climate, et cetera, and you sort of discuss that with them, where you have in the case of the mobile phone mast, where you have the conversation about planning law and how it works and how you've got to put essential infrastructure somewhere and how the decisions are made and make that person feel better. In the context of the elections, the discussion around, how democracy works and the fact that sometimes your guy loses and how we handle that. All of these are the sort of deliberations that need to take place. And I think we're sort of still, in many cases, stuck at the level of, well, you've expressed a doubt, or you've expressed, wrong or misinformation. We're either going to throw the right information at you in the assumption that will change your mind, or we're just going to delete it altogether in the assumption that may help you change your mind. And I'm not sure either of those is going to work.
And it goes to the heart of something that we've come back to several times before, and that is that there's an insufficient understanding of human nature underpinning a lot of the different tech policy problems that we're looking at right now. If you look at, for example, truth, we never evolved to seek truth. We evolved to, Julia Galef, who is a brilliant author and a cognitive scientist, has written about this, and she suggests that we have two minds. We have a scout mind that looks for novelty, where we're looking for new things, and we want to sort of discover new things, however crazy they may seem, and we have a soldier mind that looks for cohesion, social cohesion. So the two kinds of truths that we have evolved to deal with is one in which we just seek what's new, which means it's ultimately doubt and it's exploratory. And the other is we seek to believe what others believe that we want to belong to the in-group with. And so if that is your starting point, if you start from sort of an evolutionary psychology starting point, then in fact, just erasing misinformation strengthens the soldier mind and quashes the scout mind and will just create a very adverse reaction. So you're worsening the problem because people will then go more into their clusters. By fighting misinformation, you create the filter bubbles you thought you were going to dissolve.
Yeah. Exactly. And I again, I'll come back to one of my repeated themes, which is if you get people round the table and first of all agree on what it is you're trying to achieve, from that, you may then come to a strategy to achieve that. And so again, in this sort of context of misinformation, what you're not trying to achieve, I think, is the removal of the content. And there's too much of that. It's too much of, I'm the government or the civil society critic, and I'm saying to the platforms, this content is on your platform, as long as you don't get rid of it, you're evil. And I'm just telling you, you've got to get rid of it. And then the platform sort of fighting back, going, why are you telling me to do that? Actually, you needed the platform and the civil society experts and the government to sit down around the table and say, what are we trying to achieve? What we're trying to achieve is increased take-up of the vaccination, for example. Okay, now we've decided what we're trying to achieve as a common goal, and the goal is not the removal of the misinformation. The goal is the take-up of the vaccination. Let's work back from that. Okay, if we remove this misinformation, does it make it more or less likely that people will take the vaccine? Well, let's look at the best research, and let's look at cognitive scientists and behavioral scientists, and then let's look at the research that people have done on what happens when you remove misinformation, whether it changes people's minds or not. Let's look at the research that tells us what happens when you present people with the alternative viewpoint. Let's look at what happens when you color all of the good information green and all of the bad information red. I mean, there's 100 different ways that you could approach this problem. But sit around the table together, agree the common objective, look at all the different ways you could address it, and then agree a common strategy that says, right, shared objective, assuming there is one, and sometimes there won't be. If the shared objective or the objective of the government is, we want you to suppress the misinformation that's coming from the political opposition. Imagine the Russian government today would, they were sitting at the table, they would say, the important thing is to suppress all that misinformation that comes from this Alexei Navalny guy. Well, probably not going to have a common objective there. But on other areas, certainly vaccination, climate change may be more contentious. There'll be some governments who don't share a common objective necessarily with platforms around that. But the areas where you do have a common objective, agree that, then get the best possible information about the different strategies you could approach, and then agree on a common strategy. And I think the mistake that we make so often is that the goal is the removal of the misinformation. It isn't. It's something else that we think the either removal or different treatment of misinformation will help us achieve.
Surprisingly often feels as if technology policy is a set of shallow solutions to what are really deep and often psychological or behavioral problems, where the use of the technology is not in focus, but merely sort of what the technology currently contains or the misinformation online. But is there a remedy for this to sort of move technology policy away from what is largely symbolic action to actually have a conversation about that deeper thing you point to, about what we want to achieve? Do you see signs of this happening, or do you think that it's still, very tempting for decision makers to seek the quick fix, to seek the technical fix, to put the filter on, to use the AI, to sort of just generally make sure that the technology is just kludge after kludge, not doing anything that you're upset about?
I mean, I think part of the historical problem is you have two complex worlds that don't understand each other and don't necessarily respect each other. And so, again, use the sort of cliches on the tech side. You've got people who are, they've got a whole language. I mean, languages. They talk differently, they act differently from politicians, and they often, feel that they are superior. Let's be entirely candid that they've come up with a brilliant technical way of fixing something, and the politicians are kind of dumb and irrational over there, and they just don't get it. They don't understand how the world works. And then on the political side, you have politicians who, again, to be candid, many of them genuinely don't understand how the technology works. That can be quite threatening. They feel threatened and undermined by these arrogant technologists, and they want to take them down a peg or two. And that's without really understanding what it is that they're asking for. And that's just not a great dynamic for finding solutions where neither side really respects each other. They're not sort of working along the same path. I think that is shifting now. To a certain extent. And I think this is, again, where I see hope in some of the regulatory structures that might come forward. So I think a good regulatory structure, above all, would force these two communities. They're both legitimate. Again, technologists do understand the technology better. They genuinely can, I think, come up with better solutions if they're so minded than many of the solutions that the politicians would come up with. But politicians have legitimacy, a mandate. They represent the people in their country. They have an authority that technology companies don't have. And so I think if you can create a scenario where you bring those two forces together and create some mutual respect. And I think the best way to do that I've seen in my experience has been when it's been very concrete. And when you've looked at, you park your allegiances at the door and you look at a problem together, and you may have had the same experience of being in some of the discussions, for example, around counterterrorism. When you're in the middle of attacks on your societies and you feel it both as a citizen and a technologist, and you go into a room with the politicians and you say, let's just put everything to one side and say, how do we together come up with solutions to deal with a real problem, which is people organizing or inciting terrorist attacks through the platforms? Get some great solutions. So that can really work. And I've seen it in child safety as well, where people come together and work together. So I think to the extent that a regulatory solution forces that conversation, I think that's extremely helpful. Back to the subject of our sort of work today and truth, I actually think this is going to be, though, one of the hardest areas. And I think the reason it's going to be hard is because it affects a vital interest of the political side of this equation. So if we talk about things like terrorism and child abuse, in most cases, there won't be any sort of contention between the parties. Whether you're a party of the left or the right, you dislike child abuse, you dislike terrorism, there's a sort of unified view. And if you're on the technology side of things, it doesn't matter which party the politician is coming from, they're going to be asking you for similar things. Once you get into some of this sort of truth, mistruth area, again, let's be really candid. There are some administrations of some parties, typically on the right, who, for example, are fighting against the notion that there's man-made climate change. And then there'll be other parties, either on the left or the green persuasion, for whom this is the number one priority. So you can imagine there as a platform, you could be sitting down with the government in one country and they're saying, this is what we absolutely need you to do. You've got to deal with this climate change misinfo. Cross the border, and there's somebody saying, what the hell are you doing? Suppressing people who are expressing reasonable doubts about climate change. And the people you may be suppressing might include actual ministers within the government or spokespeople of the government. So as I say, I think there's a spectrum from relatively easy in terms of there being no political divide through to issues that are the heart of political debates in different countries. And the misinformation truth debate is often at that hardest end, where it's an issue that is highly contentious and where the politicians see the platform policy as actually instrumental in whether or not they get elected. And nothing could be more existential for a politician.
And it's interesting that you bring up for example, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism and the way that tech companies work together with governments in that particular issue in order to get to a common result. Because if you make the accusation that tech policy is often shallow, you can say that the reaction from tech companies sometimes is overly reactive and not necessarily trying to address the problem. You could argue that tech companies have a very legitimate and interesting problem in figuring out how we establish a common baseline of facts. That's a problem that can be approached with technology, but more importantly, and this is also the case for the terrorism example, with institutions. Because one of the most interesting things about the examples that you mentioned is that in both of those cases, child safety and the case of counterterrorism, the result of the collaboration was an externalization of the issue to a third body, to a forum or to the Internet Watch Foundation or NICMEC. What you've done in those cases is that you've built new institutions. And if you think about something like the truth, it doesn't really belong within politics, because as Hannah Arendt pointed out, politics and truth have always been uneasy bedfellows, right? And I think one of the other things that is really interesting is that it doesn't belong in a private company. It doesn't belong in a private enterprise, which suggests to me that there could be an institutional answer here as well. And what comes to mind, of course, is the Wikipedia, that has managed as a kind of institution to negotiate truth on a number of different issues. And it's not perfect. There are editing wars and there are all kinds of things. And you can argue that over time, there is an entropy setting in, will make it very hard for the Wikipedia to survive the next 20 years. But there is something there about the externalization of this issue into an institution as a more durable solution to it than simply trying to sort of smash each other over the head with either pure legislation or technical fixes. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think many people in the media, the classic media, would say that's exactly what they exist to do. They exist to be the truth carriers within society, or the truth definers, and part of their professionalism is to be able to do that. I think there's certainly a lot we could do, as we discussed earlier around information quality. There's a lot we could do to help people understand why a piece of information is being presented the way it is, and the robustness of it. And you're right, Wikipedia is a good example that you know that the articles are reasonably robust because you know how the sausage is made. You know what's gone into it. It's very transparent about what's gone into it. There's a very explicit process, actually a sort of more explicit process than there is, for example, for much of the media editing, where you simply take it on trust that the journalists are checking multiple sources, et cetera, et cetera. You assume that. Wikipedia has sort of made it explicit that that's happening. So I think there's a lot we can go to in that, but I think we should also be really candid, and that many of the things that people most care about in this debate are never, they're not going to be answered by saying, here's a single truth, and we can run with it. And an example I've used before, which I find fascinating, is you can bring things, some of the most important things to you in your life, you've brought into being by talking about them. They don't depend on a scientific underpinning. And the example I'd use is saints' bones, which I've saying that if you live in a particular community in a country where this is important, particularly sort of Catholic countries, one of the most important things in your community life can be the fact that you have a relic, that there's a bone of a saint that's in the local cathedral and forms a really important part of the social life of the city. Now, that is a bone of a saint because everyone believes it's a bone of a saint, and to send somebody in to do radiocarbon dating or whatever and try and prove that it's not is kind of neither here nor there. That's not really relevant to why that is important. So it is a fact, as far as everybody in the community believes, that is the bone of Saint X, because they all believe it. And I use that analogy because I think it's similar with a lot of the things that we have in politics, and this is the real challenge. It is a fact for a lot of people on the right of politics in the United States that the election was stolen. And that has become established in this, and will be established over time. And simply presenting some other information is not going to make it feel like less of a fact. So the Wikipedia entry that tells you exactly what happened in the US election is great. It's really important that it's there. But it's not probably going to address the concern that people have, which is a large number of believers. Let's use that language. Believers who have faith in the fact that the election was stolen. So how do we deal with that? I think is the challenge that people are putting out there. The Wikipedia entry is part of it. The common foundation of facts is part of it, but it's almost, when you talk about it, it's almost more aspirational. It's not there's a common basis of facts. It's that there's a common basis of facts, and everybody believes in those facts as opposed to believing in something else. And now we're in a territory of belief, which I say is much more complex to address than the territory of, rational scientific proof. You say A, I say B. If I've got more evidence for B, you stop saying A and you start saying B. Like that's not how this stuff is working in most of the areas that people most care about.
And I think a sort of corollary to that is that, of course, we also need to talk about long truths. So what happens with truth over time is really interesting, right? One of the reasons Holocaust denial is so caustic is that over time, if you just accrue with denial of an historical event, that historical event erodes and the record of it erodes. If you go forward 5, 6, 7 generations, it becomes harder and harder for future generations to suss out what actually happened. So the institution does matter, and the institution does preserve truth over time. But it's sometimes going to be very hard to establish that institution. It's interesting with saints' bones. I read somewhere that some of the more prominent saints seem to have had around 800 fingers. If every single bone is actually a saint's bone, which is to your point, exactly right. It's not a question of fact; it's a question of belief. Yeah. But ultimately, at some point, we need those facts in order to be able to deliberate as a society, and we need that common baseline of facts to make political decisions. So I guess that the real question is if over time we can evolve an institution that will at least give us back a little bit more of that than we have right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think let's pull it all together. I think we need both facts and belief. So the facts on their own are not going to solve many of the issues that we're worried about. So again, putting the facts out there about the COVID vaccination is not necessarily going to shift the dial on the people who believe the vaccinations are wrong for whatever reason they believe that. We need it. So it's a baseline. You've got to have them. So don't give up on the facts. We don't want to give up on it. We want to create them, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that that's the end of the story, or even perhaps the main event. I mean, the facts may turn out to be the easy bit, and the hard bit is the belief piece. And how do we shift beliefs that people have? Well, we shift beliefs. That's a curious framing, anyway. How does if society or those who are dominant in society have decided their belief needs to be shifted, how do they shift that? I mean, we're almost sort of in that space. Your Holocaust denial example, I think, is really interesting because, again, one of the things about belief is people believe things they want to believe, and we need to recognize that. And so I think you're right that post-war in Germany, I think most people in Germany would have wanted to believe that the Holocaust wasn't as bad as it was. That would have been their natural instinct. And so the institutions of the German state took extraordinary efforts to force people not to believe the thing they wanted to believe, but to understand what the truth was. So it's a fascinating example. And I talk to people in Germany, the extent to which, the education system, the institutions of the state, really took very dramatic steps to force people to confront that. This is highly political, but we're having a sort of debate in the UK at the moment about our role in empire and the fact that we never had. And I'm very sympathetic to this argument. We've never had that. It's much easier for us to believe that India benefited hugely from the Brits being there, and we weren't stealing everything from them. We were giving them things like religion and smallpox and all those fun stuff. So there's this sort of view that we've not confronted it because it is human to take the path of least resistance and the thing that makes you feel better about yourself. So when you're confronting anything historical, you will want to believe the gilded version of the history unless an institution forces you to believe the hard version. I actually think there's a lot of this in climate change as well. If you believe in man-made climate change, you're setting yourself up for a harder path than if you believe that it's not really happening and you can just carry on as you are today. So the real challenge in many cases is how does one get people to believe the hard thing when their default position is to go with believing the easy thing. The easy thing is to believe you was robbed in an election. You really won it. You're the top dogs, but the other side cheated. That's a lot easier than believing the hard thing, which is you were rejected. That most of your fellow citizens don't agree with you. And if you flip that around, the hard thing with Brexit and Donald Trump elections was for people to believe that most of their fellow citizens, certainly in the case of Brexit, a majority of their fellow citizens believe that. In the case of Donald Trump, citizens in the right places for their electoral system believe that. But, it is hard to believe some things over other things. And that, I think, is a really important, again, part of the debate that we often miss. If we're not thinking about what motivates people to believe particular scenarios, and we're simply focused on whether or not we can prove that they're true or false, then in many cases we'll sort of miss the main event.
It's true. Well, I think that wraps it up very nicely. Thank you so much. So this podcast can be found on your website at
regulate.tech.
And thank you everyone for listening. Keep your comments coming, and ideas or suggestions are always welcome. And we will be back next week. Thank you so much.